So, good afternoon. It's 4:15 sharp, so we can start. Thank you to everybody for being here. This is part of a larger event that will also see some closed-door meetings on the theme of relaunching international trade, also looking at the G20 meetings and beyond, and particularly concentrating on the plans for the G20 in Japan. And this initiative is also under the auspices and with the help of the Foreign Ministry of Japan, and we are grateful for this, and we have the General Consul here. Thank you for being here with us. This particular panel will deal with the issue of it's a sexy issue, is a new global crisis on the horizon. There is a mixture here of financial risks that are a little bit all over the place, and trade wars that can cause financial crisis or can be the caused by financial crisis. So there's a two-way relationship between trade tensions and financial tensions. So we're going to have a nice panel to discuss these issues and the governance plans that we can imagine to cope with them. But first we have a keynote speaker, Bernard Hookman, who is Director of Global Economics at the Robert Schuman Center of the European University in Florence. And he will give us his own thoughts on these general matters and introduce the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm very happy to see so many people interested in this topic. I've been a trade economist for a very long time, and until Mr. Trump hit the scene, trade was not exactly a very sexy topic. So financial crises always have been, unfortunately always will be. I very much hope that trade is not going to be as much of a high-profile issue as it has been recently. So you all read in the newspapers every day about some new thing that has happened with respect to trade. Often, this is Mr. Trump making an announcement about he's going to hit Canada, Mexico, the EU. Most of the attention, of course, is China. I think it's fair to say that the global trading system that has been established and built up since the Second World War is in a state of existential crisis. I think it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that the system is very much under threat, and to a large extent, that is in part because of geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. We have China rising rapidly, becoming a major economic power, and the United States deciding that that power needs to be either stopped or channeled into the right direction, managed. It very much depends where you're coming from, but clearly there's this geopolitical rivalry underlying the trade disputes. At the same time, I think it's important to also recognize that this is part of a broader phenomenon, and the broader phenomenon is what is sometimes called the rise of the rest. Developing countries have been growing much faster than the OECD countries for decades. Certainly not all of them, but we have a large number of countries that have grown dramatically. And if you look at just shares in world GDP, shares in world trade, and if you compare the 1960s, 70s to where we are today, we see a very different world. So it's not just China. China is, of course, the biggest economy that has been the fastest growing economy, but we also have India, we have Brazil, we have Southeast Asia. There are a lot of countries that are now important players in world trade and are defending their interests and pushing for what they think makes sense for them. So one way to think about this is we have the US and China engaging in geopolitical rivalry, but we also have the US against all the other countries in the world, which is not just developing countries, but it also includes countries like the European Union. And to some extent, what we're seeing today in terms of trying to understand what the United States is trying to do is essentially trying to rebalance the deal that was struck over the last few decades. And if you listen to Mr. Trump and you try and translate what he's saying into what he may be trying to do, you say, I want more reciprocity. I want the rest of the world to basically start paying more. I want the same type of trade policy we have in the United States. I want to see that in our trading partners. And in fact, I actually want you to do more, right? Because you need to pay us back. So I think that is another theme that is underlying what is going on. It's what is sometimes called in the literature the declining hegemon phenomenon that we're seeing playing out, unfortunately. But then the third dimension is all of us, the European Union, the rest of the world. How do we react to the rise of China? How do we react to the rise of developing countries? But also, how do we react to this policy that is being pursued by the United States? And unfortunately, we're in the middle, right? On the one hand, we want to trade with China, but we also have concerns with respect to the regime that is in place in China, the types of policies that are being pursued in China. So we share a lot of the concerns that the United States has, but at the same time, the United States has concerns with the European Union, right? We're running too much of a surplus. He wants to have trade rebalanced. So again, that creates a lot of tensions. Now, what the United States is doing in terms of the trade wars that we read about on a daily basis, in part, this is old-fashioned protectionism. Essentially, Mr. Trump likes to call himself the tariff man. He likes tariffs. And what he's trying to do by raising tariffs is to say, well, let's make it more difficult for all these countries which have been given what he regards as unfair access to the United States. Let's make that access more difficult, right? Let's raise taxes against those countries. Those taxes will be paid by American consumers, which is a point he never wants to admit. But essentially, it's all about let's stop exports into the United States. This is a lot, I regard this as a lot of nostalgia. Because in a sense, what they're trying to do is to go back to a world which no longer exists. Because it's not so much trade that has been the cause of the adjustment problems in the United States, the loss of manufacturing employment. That has much more to do with technology, and that is not going to, you can't turn the clock back in that sense. So one part of what we read about is old-fashioned protectionism, trying to do something which I think is doomed to fail, which will be very costly both for the United States and for the rest of the world. But the other part of what we see in terms of what is driving the trade wars, in particular with respect to what the US is doing, is it's not only about trade, but it's also about technology. It's about investment. It's about preventing, and I'm going to put this a bit, I'm not going to be particularly nuanced here, it's about preventing US firms from leaving the US. It's trying to encourage US firms from coming back to the US. So essentially, this is something we also see in developing countries. The objective is make it here. Don't make it in the world. And one of the things we have seen over the last 20 years or so is companies have engaged in a lot of outsourcing. They've established global value chains, supply chains. There's been a lot of trade in intermediates. Goods will cross borders many times before they're embodied in a final product. And one way of thinking about what Mr. Trump objects to, but also what Mr. Modi objects to, what a lot of politicians object to, is this notion that products are not made in my country anymore. They're made everywhere. They're made in the world. And I think partly what we're seeing is a backlash to that. Now, how is that being done? Partly, Tariff Man says, I will raise tariffs to make it more difficult to ship these goods into the United States. But partly it's being done through something which is really creating, I think, the real big existential risk for the trading system today, is to justify actions on the basis of national security, right? And this is the big, I would say, new thing that the Trump administration, in terms of use, and what it implies is really a weaponization of trade policy, because it's no longer just about, I'm going to make it more difficult for you to export goods to my market. I'm going to make it much more difficult for you to produce in the first place. And how do I do that? I do that by preventing you, in this case this is China, preventing your firms from actually getting all the inputs they need to produce. Right? And the big example that we read about, again, in the newspapers, I keep on coming back to the newspapers because we actually read about this in real time, the Chinese company Huawei, which is being told, you can no longer sell to me, but I'm also going to prevent my companies from selling things to you. And this is not just about US companies not being allowed to sell things to the Chinese company, it's also about us, Europeans. We're not allowed to do this either. Why? Because if one of our companies sells to Huawei, if those companies also deal with the United States, they are liable for all kinds of actions that might be taking place in the United States. So there's an extraterritorial dimension to US policy, which I think is of great concern, especially because it's being justified by national security. Now, I'm already probably over time. So very briefly, where do trade agreements come into this? And of course, we in Europe have had the exercise of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We've concluded the agreement with Canada. It's very controversial, these agreements. There's a lot of resistance to those agreements. But I would argue that trade agreements, including the WTO, are not really the reason for the problems we're seeing today, the trade tensions we're seeing today. It's not because China joined the WTO that China became the powerhouse it is today. That would have happened with or without the WTO. Trade agreements, I would argue, are also not the solution to the problems we're seeing today. Think about the Chinese experience in negotiating with the United States. China has negotiated now for almost 2 years, and every time they came close to a deal, the United States blew up the deal. Right? So essentially, what you're seeing is that efforts to try and negotiate a deal are failing. And I would argue they're doomed to fail precisely because the United States, to my mind, doesn't really want a deal. They want to stop China, stop trade. We see the same thing in Mexico, right? So the decision by President Trump, despite the fact that they've renegotiated the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, so the NAFTA agreement became the United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. Despite that whole renegotiation, from one day to the next, Mr. Trump decides, I'm going to put 5% tariffs on Mexican exports, and next week it's going to be 10, and if they don't do what I want them to do, it's going to end up 25. So what's the value of a trade agreement in that context, right? So we have a great deal of effort being put into negotiating things which at the end of the day might not really deal with the uncertainty, might not fix the problem. And the use of the national security argument is another kind of really big hole which is being shot in trade agreements, because if you can invoke national security, trying to negotiate rules of the game really doesn't do much for you. So one final word on the WTO. The big problem for the WTO today is that that organization was conceived as the platform, as the venue where countries would come together and negotiate when they have problems with each other. That's not happening today, right? So the fact that the US is unilaterally renegotiating trade agreements, exerting all kinds of trade pressure on countries, is a sign of failure of the WTO. The WTO was supposed to prevent these types of things from happening. It's a very long discussion to explain why the WTO failed. I think one important factor is the rise of developing countries and this perception that the institution is no longer taking into account that there's an imbalance in the institution. I think a lot of it has to do with working practices in the WTO. The WTO works by consensus. So everybody has to agree before anything can happen. And that has led to a lot of countries, including the European Union, to negotiate bilateral trade agreements with countries that want to go and do more than is possible in the WTO. But ultimately, I think we're in a very bad situation at the moment with respect to the WTO. I very much hope dialogue and agreements can be resuscitated in Geneva. There are signs of hope in the sense that there are ongoing negotiations on important subjects. For example, e-commerce would be one where we have the United States, China, and the European Union all sitting at the same table negotiating, which I think is a very positive sign. We have a trilateral effort by the United States, Japan, and the European Union to try and figure out where to go and fix some of these problems with respect to the particular policies that are a source of concern. So there are positive dimensions, but I think it's going to be a real challenge to try and get agreements done. I think the critical factor in the short run is to conclude the e-commerce negotiations that are ongoing, which are very important for all of us. This is about regulating and governing the digital economy. If that can be brought to a successful conclusion, then I think we're making some progress in dealing with things, but at the same time, there's a huge agenda, obviously, that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Professor Hookman. With an expert like you dealing with such important issues like the crisis of trade, one says, well, he's going to say something nuanced that will give me some hope. While he was very hard until the very end. At the very end, you indicated a few micro-specific traits where you suggest we could have some hope. But for the rest, it's political, it's deeply political, and by the way, I've been told today that the Mexican president will not join the G20. So it's going to be as an answer to Trump. So it's really a tragic moment. Okay, thank you. And now let's go for the on the first panel, and we have three outstanding speakers. And let me start from Professor Yuka Fukunaga, which is professor at the School of Social Sciences at Waseda University in Japan. She's an expert of trade and things also in finance, in a way, have often a trade origin or a trade consequence. So she will give us her perspective briefly, and then we have the other two panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here before the distinguished audience. And to be honest, I was feeling a bit awkward because I'm a trade law expert, and I know this session focuses on financial matters. So I was feeling maybe I'm not a proper person to be in this panel. But as you clearly, vividly illustrated, there are close connections between financial matters and trade. And actually, I was trying to say an excuse of being here by illustrating the connections between past financial crisis and trade orders. For example, the Bretton Woods system was created in order to avoid another Great Depression. And after the financial crisis in Asia in 1997, Asian countries started to expand the network of free trade agreements. And after global financial crisis in 2007, yes, the WTO started a new system of trade monitoring. So, and Professor Hookman also mentioned that the WTO was or maybe is considered as a platform to respond to those crises. And if there is any financial crisis in the future, there has to be a firm trading system. So that's why I'm going to speak about WTO reform, and hopefully that will be an introduction to the next session, which will focus on WTO in general. So I think there are two issues in terms of WTO reform, and one of them is the rulemaking. So I'll make some comments on the rulemaking. Well, as you have already known, the WTO has made only a limited success in terms of the rulemaking. Of course, the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement was adopted some years ago, and the Trade Facilitation Agreement came into force in 2017, but there are more failures than successes, unfortunately. And there, for example, we had the Doha Development Agenda. We had a high expectation with respect to the DDA, but it didn't produce any tangible results. And we also had, or maybe have, some plurilateral negotiations on services and also environmental goods. But until now, those plurilateral negotiations have not produced any results. And as Professor Hookman mentioned, there are some ongoing negotiations, and we are expecting that fishery subsidies negotiations will be concluded by the end of the year, but it's far from clear. So I have mentioned some negative developments in trade, but as Professor Hookman mentioned, there are some positive developments as well in the field of electronic commerce. Some members, 71 members, issued a joint declaration on to initiate exploratory work to negotiate trade-related aspects of electronic commerce. And this year, last January this year, 76 members issued a joint declaration to confirm their intention to commence WTO negotiations on this issue. And Prime Minister Abe insisted his determination to start the so-called Osaka track in the upcoming G20 Summit in Osaka. And he's been insisting that he wants to build a new global data governance, which will be called Data Free Flow with Trust, DFFT. And so there is strong hope that there will be the adoption of a new agreement or perhaps amendments to the existing WTO agreements. And personally, I strongly hope that these negotiations will produce some tangible results. And as Professor Hookman said, if this leads to a tangible result, this will be a key to the reinvigoration of the WTO. So I have a very high expectation. But at the same time, I stay a bit cautious about the future of these initiatives. Because to me, it seems to me there is a critical difference between the conventional trade negotiations and electronic commerce negotiations. But that critical difference may not be fully taken into account in these initiatives. So in order to highlight the difference between the conventional trade negotiations and electronic commerce negotiations, I took so much time to find good metaphors to illustrate this difference. And to me, the conventional trade negotiations are somewhat like a karate practitioner who is trying to break walls. You know, just like karate practitioner meditates before he does something, trade negotiators took much time to think how to remove trade barriers. And just like a karate practitioner breaks the wall by his own fist, only gradually the trade negotiators removed trade barriers, only progressively. So the process of conventional trade negotiations was very slow. But on the other hand, I found a very good metaphor for the electronic commerce negotiations. It's a whack-a-mole game. I don't know if ladies and gentlemen in this room have ever played this game, but I personally, when I was a kid, I'm very good at playing this game. I don't know if you know the concept of the game, but a mole comes out from a hole one after another, so you have to whack, you have to hit the mole before it goes back to the hole. So, just like this, in electronic commerce, now electronic commerce is inherently free, but many governments started to adopt new regulations, like a mole is coming out of the hole. And at the same time, the mall is coming back soon, coming back to the hall soon. And just like this, in the electronic commerce, the government has been changing regulations because the e-commerce itself has been changing as well. So the process has to be very quick. So by highlighting the difference in this way, what I want to say is that the old approach, just like Professor Hookman said, in the old approach, the negotiators sought to adopt an agreement, either multilateral or plurilateral. But adopting an agreement takes so much time, and perhaps adopting an agreement may not be the best way to deal with electronic commerce. We may want to think about more flexible, quicker way to deal with the e-commerce. This is my point on the rulemaking. So let me move on to dispute settlement. Again, unfortunately, the appellate body is in crisis. I think many of you are familiar with the crisis of the appellate body. There are 7 seats in the appellate body, but only 3 of them have been are filled right now. And 2 of them will be leaving at the end of the year. And the appellate body has to be at least 3 members to hear an appeal. So after December this year, there is a likelihood that the appellate body can no longer hear an appeal. And I have to mention briefly some worrying developments in Japan. And well, there was an appellate body's decision in the dispute involving Korea's import bans on certain food products from Japan. And after that decision, the Japanese government started to criticize the appellate body for overreaching its mandate. And at the same time, there is a distrust among the civil society in Japan against the appellate body. And some of the people in Japan started to say that the appellate body made a wrong decision because there are only 3 members. I don't necessarily share that assessment. However, I can say that there is a feeling in Japan that because there are only 3 members in the appellate body is not doing their job properly. So that's why we have to improve the appellate body very quickly. And many members have made proposals to improve the appellate body. I think the next session will discuss these issues. I'm not going to talk much about the detail, but there are proposals, and there is a hope that the members reach some kind of agreement to basically satisfy the United States' dissatisfaction with the appellate body. And I hope this initiative, this discussion will lead to satisfy, in the end, the United States. However, we also have to be prepared. We have to be ready for the situation where those members cannot reach an agreement. And this is my message on this point. Now is the time to choose. Functioning 1-tier dispute settlement is better than an incapacitated 2-tier dispute settlement. So we have to continue talking on the improvements of the appellate body. We have to try to reinvigorate the appellate body, but at the same time, we have to be ready for the possibility that the appellate body cannot hear an appeal anymore. And to me, the most important thing is to make sure that the dispute settlement can work even without the appellate body. I don't go into detail, but I repeat what I said. We have to make sure that the WTO dispute settlement has to continue working even without the appellate body. So I don't talk much about this slide. Anyway, what I want to say is that perhaps we have to explore innovative approaches to the WTO. As I mentioned, in the electronic commerce, perhaps conventional approaches may not work properly to deal with the problems. And in the field of dispute settlement, perhaps we cannot rely too much on the appellate body. So in any event, we have to think out of the box. We have to think innovative approaches. Now, to conclude, well, there will be the G20 Summit in Osaka this month. and WTO reform will be one of the most important topics in the summit. And as an academic, what I hope is my hope is that the world leaders agree not only the need to reform the WTO, but they show the vision of how they should reform the WTO. That's all. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Before we leave this trade